Hello and welcome to the Clean Energy Pod powered by SSE, your guide to the people and technologies delivering the clean energy transition. On today's episode, we hear from Paul Cooley, Director of Offshore Wind here at SSE. On the pod, we'll learn why does it take more than a decade to build an offshore wind farm in the UK? What are the main challenges building the world's largest offshore wind farm at Dogger Bank? What chances do the UK have of meeting its offshore wind targets for 2030? And what key advice would he give to anybody looking to enter the industry? Paul, thanks very much for joining us on the Clean Energy Pod. You are Director of Offshore Wind for SSE Renewable, is that correct?
Yeah.
That sounds like a cracking job, especially given the fact you're building the world's largest offshore wind farm. Tell us about that project first of all, and then we'll talk about the industry. But tell us about the world's biggest offshore wind farm. What is it? How's it going? How did you end up building this?
Well, yeah, the largest offshore wind farm in the world is Dogger Bank, and it's a 3.6 gigawatt offshore wind farm. So that's 3,600 megawatts of electricity it's going to generate from the site when it's operational. It's already started operating, so we already have a number of turbines up and running. And the project's been over 12 years in the making. We secured the seabed, over 10 years ago. Developed the project through consenting. Achieved FID back in 2020.
What does FID stand for?
Financial investment decision. So we made the decision to invest with our partners Equinor in the turn of this decade, and we're right in the middle of construction now. Installing turbines, we have all the foundations installed in the first phase. We've installed and commissioned the first HVDC offshore wind farm connection.
That's the cable basically that plugs it in.
Exactly, and we're between 150 and 200 kilometers from shore.
Wow.
So it's the furthest, the offshore wind farm that's furthest from shore in the world. So a number of firsts. We're using the largest turbines, the first HVDC connected offshore wind farm in the UK, and really breaking a lot of barriers in terms of scale and delivery for this kind of asset.
And we hear a lot about innovation in other industries, for instance, tech and things like that, bio and everything else. We don't hear so much from a clean energy perspective, but what you're telling me is there is a lot of innovation in the industry.
The story of innovation in offshore wind goes right back to its initiation, back when Electricity built Ireland's first offshore wind farm at Arklow Bank, and when we built, SSE built the UK's, at the time, the UK's largest offshore wind farm at Greater Galbert. The turbine sizes were, 2.5 megawatts each. Those turbines that we're installing in Dogger Bank now are 13, 14 megawatts. So there's been a continuous innovation around the turbine technology.
So you've gone from 2 megawatts to 13 or 14 megawatts. Indeed. Just for somebody who doesn't pay that much attention to this, give us an indication of just what a difference that is in terms of scale and performance.
The height of the turbine is maybe 150 meters tall, so still very tall. But when we then move up to the latest technology we're installing, these things are 250, 300 meters tall. They're massive structures. They produce 3 times, 4 times the electricity that those pioneering turbines that we installed back in the noughties, essentially, when we first moved offshore. And just the scale and complexity involved is massive. The blades are 80, 90 meters long, so each blade is a massive structure in itself. And if you think about the turbines that we're using in Dogger Bank, imagine the London Eye, a structure that a lot of people are familiar with. Well, increase the diameter of the London Eye by 50% and raise it 150 meters in the air. For Dogger Bank, then multiply that by 280 turbines. So 280 London Eyes lifted 150 meters in the air and made 50% bigger. That's the scale of the project that we're building.
And these are just mind-blowing statistics. I mean, how easy is it to get that kind of equipment out into the sea, first of all, and then actually install it? I mean, that, as you see, these are mega structures in their own right.
What's useful in some regards in terms of offshore wind is that we use a lot of the same technology that's been pioneered in the oil and gas industry for the last 20, 30, 40 years. So although the vessels in some cases are bigger than anything we've had before, the technology for transporting these turbines, for installing and lifting these turbines, and for connecting them up, ultimately with cables, is pretty established. And the environment that we're working in is a familiar environment for the oil and gas sector. So while it has its own challenges in terms of, for oil and gas, you're maybe taking one structure out and installing it, whereas in this case, we're installing 200, 300 of these structures. The technology is actually well established. So it's really about making sure that we have the economies of scale, making sure we get access to those vessels and that equipment, and having competent contractor and supplier partners that can install and ultimately help us operate these assets.
And how do you get your mind around a project of that size and of that scale? Because that must be one of the biggest infrastructure projects this country's ever seen. What are the big challenges for you as somebody who's overseeing that kind of project?
Well, typically, and in some respects, we have some of the same challenges that any infrastructure project has. You've got to get planning. In the case of energy infrastructure, you've got to get grid connections, and you've got to get suppliers that'll kind of bring that project through to delivery. The other big difference, though, with offshore wind is just the sheer figures involved in financing these things. So we're into, in the case of Dogger Bank, over £10 billion worth of investment. A lot of that is debt. So a lot of it comes from the lending community. So we have multiple banks, multiple financial institutions supporting us. So while it's an infrastructure delivery project, a big piece of work for delivering the financing of that project is really through debt financing and equity financing. So that's where having a partner like Equinor and SSE in partnership in Dogger Bank, there's a lot of balance sheet there. And because of our credibility in terms of building and operating these kind of assets, there's a huge amount of interest from the lending community to provide funding. So it's kind of an unusual mix of a big financial instrument and a big infrastructure delivery project.
And is that presumably because it costs an awful lot of money, billions and billions to build a large wind farm initially, but then the payback is over a long period of time? And for instance, how long would you estimate a Dogger Bank or any other offshore wind farm to last?
Well, we design our wind farms, a number of years back, we'd have been designing these things for 25 years. Now we expect them to run for 35 or 45 or 40 years. So the operating lifetime of the assets is getting longer because the technology is maturing, getting more robust. But the financing generally is over 15 to 20 years. So we expect to pay back our debt in over that period of time. And obviously there's a return to our equity and investors and ultimately our shareholders as well.
And some people might think, well, the wind blows, it's free, therefore this should be a very, very cheap industry. How do you respond to that kind of question?
Well, where renewables infrastructure and renewables projects differ from, say, building a gas-fired power station, is that all the cost goes up front in the asset. And indeed, there is an operating cost, but there's no fuel cost. In that respect, the wind is free. But the upfront capex is much greater per megawatt hour or per kilowatt hour of energy we produce. So it's quite a different financial investment. It's high risk on capex, and obviously we need the wind to blow. At the times we want it to blow, and there's a certain amount of unpredictability in that. So in terms of the investment structure, it's quite different from, as I say, a gas-fired power station where you've got to buy the fuel. So the risks in a conventional power station is the cost of fuel, cost of gas, the cost of coal, the cost of oil. In our case, it's the yield of the wind from the wind farm. So it's a kind of a different. There's still big capex investments, but the risk profile is quite different.
Now, you're building Dogger Bank off the UK coast. And as I say, it's going to be the world's biggest offshore wind farm when it's finished. How did you and how did the UK get in a position where it is genuinely world leading in this stuff? Why is the UK a good place to build this kind of infrastructure?
Well, there's a few things that the UK has to its advantage, particularly for offshore wind. Clearly, Northwest Europe is a windy place. And Ireland and the UK are islands off the northwest of Europe, so we've got a really good wind resource and wind regime, and that regime, that wind power gets even stronger when you go offshore versus onshore wind. So it's got a natural geographical advantage. We have a big coastline, which means there's lots of points at which we can connect and operate from for offshore investments. But really importantly, we've got strong government support and strong regime in the CFD structure. which is part of the value of, and part of the benefit of bringing in those both our own investors and also lenders into our projects, because that CFD regime is very stable and very predictable once it's contracted.
And that CFD stands for Contract for Difference, essentially a deal the developers will have with the government where you get a fixed price for a period of time, 15 years or so, which allows you to raise the money to kind of build these developments.
Exactly. And the UK has led the world in that kind of structure, and it continues to this day.
Does that cost taxpayers a lot of money, or actually are there benefits to it?
Well, what we've worked out is that particularly over the last number of offshore CFD auctions, over the lifetime of those projects and over the lifetime of those CFD contracts, the wind farm is actually paying the government more than it's receiving from the government.
Because a lot of the time this is framed as a kind of subsidy. So this is an industry that needs subsidy to exist. You're saying that's actually not the case?
Yeah, the CFD regime, the real benefit for us as developers and operators is the price stability. So we are guaranteed a price for the lifetime of the project for every unit of electricity we produce. Historically, that price was above the market price of electricity. That's certainly the case if we go back 5 or 10 years. But projects now that we are building, including Dogger Bank, including the Sea Green project that we just commissioned last year, the price that we have struck there is below the cost of energy to consumers.
So it's a maturing industry, and the more it matures, the more it saves consumers, essentially.
Exactly.
Or that's been the history for the last little while. So what role does government have then in ensuring that developers like yourself can have the confidence to make these big investments? And we're talking about billions and billions and billions. Is the system we have in the UK, is that optimized? Is it perfect, or is there more that can be done?
I think there's a lot more that can be done. The fundamental system is good. The contract mechanism in the CFD contracts is very good. The challenge we have is the dynamic of the industry has radically changed. So you described, the kind of the perception that offshore wind is subsidised, and there was a time when that was the case. That's no longer the case. And in fact, the value drivers for driving down the cost of offshore wind have also changed, and it's all about scale. It's all about scale and volume.
So the bigger, the cheaper it gets to develop this technology.
The more that's built, and the bigger the projects are, and the faster they're delivered, the lower cost it'll be.
So how do we speed them up then to lower those costs? Because we're still going through a cost of living crisis. There's an awful lot of focus on consumer bills. If this genuinely is a technology that can lower bills, then surely we'd want more of it. And that's even before we think about the energy security benefits of having our own homegrown energy. How do we get to a point where this industry can move faster, develop at an even bigger scale here in the UK and other main markets?
I think the three, if you like, the three critical elements for delivering at pace in offshore wind really are about consenting timelines, so planning timelines, grid availability, so how quickly can we get a connection, and ultimately having a sustainable price for that not just supports the investment in the wind farm, but also supports the supply chain.
Can I pick you up on that planning and consenting point first of all? Because you said earlier on, you started Dogger Bank maybe 12 years ago or something. I can't remember the exact timeline. Why did it take you 12 years from you presumably identifying the project to actually getting turbines in the water? Just break that time scale down for us.
Well, there's, first of all, one of the key elements to obtaining a consent for any of these kind of projects is a lot of survey work. So we're putting a big structure in the middle of the North Sea. So you've got to understand what are the ground conditions like, what are the wind conditions like. So we've got to measure the wind, we've got to measure the ground. We've got to do a load of environmental surveys to understand, what species are in the water, but also in the air in terms of birds and ornithology. So that all takes time, and we need years and years of data to support the studies that ultimately feed into our submission into planning. We then submit our planning submission into our planning application into the consenting process, and there's a load of statutory consultees that have to crawl over all of those reports and analysis, and ultimately then go into a consenting process where government officials make a decision whether to approve or not approve, and in a lot of cases ask for further information, ask for further studies, and you go around this kind of circular loop of assessment, submission, reassessment, and clarification.
And that all takes years and years and years.
That all takes years and years.
Can it be done quicker?
Absolutely can. So some of the bottlenecks actually are, first of all, we don't start those studies until we secure the seabed, until we secure the project. One of the nuances of the UK, and one of the benefits of the UK, is that the Crown Estate lease so that's a body of government. They lease the seabed. Well, they could do a lot of the environmental studies in advance, and they're moving towards that, so that's good. We could put statutory timelines around both the statutory consultees, so limited timelines around statutory consultee responses and government decision timelines, so we don't get into this loop of clarification, reclarification, and also prioritization of the projects. Because these infrastructure projects deliver, and energy projects deliver massive benefits to society and to the climate. But they're being processed along with a lot of other, planning decisions at government level. So really prioritizing and putting standard timelines and limited timelines around those decisions will help accelerate that. And there's I guess the final piece is resourcing. The industry is stretched for resourcing, but those consultees are also stretched for resources, and government are stretched for resources. So just putting more bodies into the process will also help reduce the time frame.
So is the current planning system fit for purpose given the amount of development that's needed?
I would say not, simply because the planning system, the resourcing and the structures and the procedures in place were designed for an era where the energy infrastructure was installed at a much lower rate, was much more concentrated in industrial areas, and certainly not at the scale that we're seeing offshore wind and the scale that we need offshore wind to deliver at. So there's a number of areas where we're both under-resourced but also not fit for purpose.
The other big driver you talked about was grid connections. So we hear quite a lot about that. Vast amounts of offshore wind being developed around the UK and Ireland, potentially. But actually, how do you no point in developing that if you can't plug it into the system to get it to homes and to businesses? What is the challenge from a grid connections perspective, and how do you fix that?
And in offshore wind, we've had in the UK, we've had a system that's been relatively fit for purpose up to now, and that's called the OFTO process, which was the offshore transmission operator process, where essentially the developer builds the grid connection and then hands it over to a third party, essentially, who operates it then for its lifetime, and that's charged back to the offshore operator. That is okay for a small number of relatively near-shore connections. What we're seeing now are much larger developments offshore, much further away from offshore, and a lot of projects being built in the same area. So there's opportunity for optimizing that. But ultimately, what we have found is that there isn't the regulatory regime for connecting that amount of offshore wind at the pace that we need to. And that's where the UK government launched the holistic network design process that, I would argue probably took a lot longer than it needed to, and went through a number of iterations. Where at one stage, the National Grid were trying to design a big integrated offshore wind grid system, which in itself became cumbersome. But that process has now made quite a bit of progress, and we're seeing dividends coming out the back end of that with grid connection offers for offshore wind now finally coming for the next wave of offshore wind projects. The challenge with that is that those dates are slipping further and further to the right, as we say.
Getting later
and later. So we really need a lot of investment on both the offshore and onshore infrastructure that's needed, and particularly the consenting of that infrastructure, the same issues that we see for offshore wind. That all needs to be accelerated to deliver the grid connection, because there's no point ultimately in getting our offshore wind farm developed and consented, financed, and having the technology ready if the grid connection is going to be 5 years behind it.
The other thing you talked about was having the policy regime in place that helps you develop these assets. The UK set a target of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. I think we're something like 14, 15 gigawatts at the moment. So there's an awful lot of work to be done in only just over 5 years. To have any chance of meeting that target, what needs to happen?
The first thing we need is, the positive is there's a lot of projects kind of ready in the pipeline. So 50 gigawatts is achievable with the projects that are currently, the backlog of projects that are currently waiting for CFD contracts and consents, and the projects, the seabed that's already been leased. So if you combine all of that together, almost gets you there. It almost gets you to the 50 gigawatts. The challenge is around delivering that quickly. And whether that's pre-2030 or post-2030, the challenge is still the same. We need to get the volume of CFD contracts through to allow those projects to be financed. We need to get the grid connections accelerated that are, for the projects that are in flight, and we need to give the supply chain the confidence that volume is going to come in the next 10 years. Because the other piece, of course, is that we're competing with oil and gas for the same supply chain. So the benefit I talked about earlier of having kind of the same technology, the same vessels as oil and gas, means we're also in competition with oil and gas to secure those vessels. So those supply chain, those suppliers, those vessel operators, those equipment manufacturers, they'll only commit to us when we have something real. We only have something real when we have a CFD contract. And unfortunately what we've seen is, the auction round 5 didn't have any offshore wind bid into it because the pricing set by government wasn't high enough.
And this is where the government holds an auction essentially for these contracts. So there's an annual auction on these nowadays. There was one, the fifth annual auction, or fifth auction was a little while ago. There were no bids on that. There's currently another auction upcoming, and then there's one next year as well. How important are they, those next couple of auctions, to securing that 50 gigawatts?
Absolutely critical. So the auction that's currently underway could deliver, because of how the auction is designed, it could deliver 4,500-5,000 megawatts of approximately 12,000 megawatt backlog of projects.
So we're at 14, 15 just now. The current auction you think could develop, what did you say?
4.5 to 5.
So let's call that 5. Let's get it up to 20. But we need to get to 50 in just 5 years' time. So that means the next auction, well, that must be a mega auction then.
Absolutely. What we call AR7 or auction round 7 is absolutely critical for delivering that, delivering anything close to the 50 gigawatts by 2030. Because bear in mind, those contracts need to be secured. The financing needs to be put in place, but the equipment has to be ordered. The vessels have to be secured. So a contract that's say awarded in 2025 will just about make it in terms of the offshore wind farm being operating by 2030. So it's really important, these auctions happen every year. So if we wait another year to 2026, then we've got, it's even bigger challenge to deliver by 2030 and so on and so on. So the real opportunity now is for auction round 7 for government to prioritise volume. That auction really needs to clear a massive volume. We would say 10 gigawatts plus in order to have any chance of achieving, the kind of pathway towards 2030. And bear in mind, it's not just about 2030, it's about net zero, it's about 2040, 2045. And again, we're on a constant, churn, a machine of building these assets to deliver on the ultimate goal, which is decarbonisation of the electricity system.
But if you have a massive step up in the auction, does that mean the taxpayer has to cough up a massive subsidy?
No, as I said earlier, we can contract at prices that are below the long-term wholesale price of electricity. So that is deliverable. So we are able to deliver value versus any other type of generation, but also deliver benefits, ultimately benefits to the consumer and benefits to the economy.
We have seen costs in the offshore industry. There have been some troubles in the last 18 months around the world in the industry. We've seen costs fell very significantly. As you said earlier on, it was an emerging technology. It was expensive. It then got an awful lot cheaper. It's coming back up now in terms of costs. Mm-hmm. Just explain some of those dynamics and what that means for the industry.
The two big drivers, well, the big drivers of cost reduction that we've seen kind of at the back end of the last decade were the scale of the turbines I talked about earlier, these mega turbines we're installing now. Also, the cost of debt was at an all-time low during that period, and the cost of commodities was very low. That has all flipped. So we've seen as post-COVID, post-Ukraine, the cost of everything has gone up, but in particular the cost of materials has gone up. So that feeds directly in. We've seen the world in a very different place this decade than it was the last decade in terms of political stability. So the cost of debt and risk premiums have all gone up as well. So those costs have definitely increased, and we've seen that reflected in what we need by way of long-term pricing for these kind of big investments. But
does that mean if the costs have increased, that offshore wind is still cost competitive relative to others like fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, of course, in the same time period we've seen, and we've all seen this in our electricity bills, the cost of gas has skyrocketed. So gas-fired generation has got more expensive as well. So the alternatives to offshore wind have increased even more. over that same period. So offshore wind still offers the best value to consumers. Ultimately, though, more expensive than it was, because everything is more expensive than it was. But ultimately, they're still the cheapest form of large-scale, clean green energy production.
Now, we talked about offshore wind principally because that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of decarbonising the power system. At the moment, that tends to be fixed to the seabed, though. Mm-hmm. One of the technologies we hear more and more about is called floating offshore wind. Mm-hmm. Can you just explain what that is and why the industry is relatively excited about its potential?
Well, one of the things that offshore wind competes with, if you like, for real estate is, there's only so much shallow seabed that's out there around the country. So although we have a big coastline, for the UK, most of the shallow seabed is off the eastern coast of the UK, between the UK and European countries. That's where Dogger Bank is. But ultimately, we're sharing that space with oil and gas. We're sharing it with shipping. We're sharing it with fishing, and a whole bunch of other uses of that, that seascape. So that's finite by its nature. What we also have, though, is off the coast of Scotland, off the west coast of Ireland, off the south coast of Ireland, is a lot of undeveloped seabed, but it's much deeper. And that's where we move into the realms of floating offshore wind. Where floating offshore wind differs, and I guess the clue is in the name to a large extent, is that instead of essentially bolting the turbine's foundation to the seabed, which we kind of do, either driving it into the seabed or pinning it into the seabed, which is kind of conventional, what we call fixed bottom offshore wind. Floating offshore wind is where the entire structure, including the turbine and its foundation, is floating but tethered to the seabed. That's an established technology in the oil and gas sector. What's different about floating offshore wind, of course, is that there are just many more structures. So the next big wave of development in offshore beyond fixed bottom, primarily in areas that don't have the seabed available to fix to the seabed, as I say, places like Scotland and Japan, for instance. Those areas will move increasingly towards floating offshore wind.
And how far away are we from that being a mainstream technology?
Well, we're developing, one of the largest floating offshore wind farms in the UK and in the world in our Ossian project in Scotland. So that's 3.6 gigawatts of potential in that area, and we're progressing that through the planning process in order to get our consents and so on. The big challenge with floating offshore wind is less about the technology and more about ultimately the economies of scale that inevitably come with deployment of this of anything that's new. So it will cost a little bit more at the beginning, and then ultimately the cost will come down as we just increase the volume of floating offshore wind. So the technology is pretty well developed. Ourselves and other people have built demonstrators and demonstrator scale projects, so it can work. The challenge is scaling up the manufacturing process, particularly for the foundations and the fixings to the seabed. And we expect that to happen really over the next 10 years, to move from kind of concept and prototype through to real, gigawatt scale that's comparable with fixed bottom offshore wind.
And if we look at a kind of map of developments across the UK coast, a lot of it's on the east coast from an offshore wind perspective, and very little on the west coast, is which kind of might surprise some people given what they know about the Atlantic. So just explain to people why the East Coast seems to be the hub for this stuff rather than the West Coast.
Well, there's an that's a very good question. There's a kind of an optimization between wind resource and, let's call it, stability of the environment that we're building and operating these assets in. So the East Coast of the UK and also the Irish Sea, so the East Coast of Ireland and the West Coast of the UK between Ireland and Wales and the north of England in particular, those areas have a kind of a sweet mix of a good wind regime and relatively benign seabed and sea conditions. So we can, and the reason that's important is that we want sea conditions that aren't too deep, so we can put those foundations in using kind of conventional technology. But we can also move people in and out to maintain and to operate the offshore turbines. So the UK's eastern seaboard and Irish Sea have a really good mix of that. As I said earlier, that's that's a limited resource in terms of, still very large, but limited resource in terms of just square acreage. when you move into particularly the west coast of Scotland and the west coast of Ireland, what happens there is the sea gets very deep very quickly, and the sea conditions get very aggressive. If anyone's been to the west of Scotland or the west of Ireland, you look out over the Atlantic Ocean, it's not just as benign an environment as the east coast. So that brings with it a whole bunch of other challenges. And the way the industry has evolved very sensibly is that you exploit the areas that are more benign and ultimately lower cost to develop first, and then you move increasingly into the areas that are more challenging.
So do you think that kind of west coast, the Atlantic coast of both the UK and also Ireland, do you think that will eventually be developed then?
There's definitely potential to develop it, but I think it's a lot further down the line. I think we'll see a lot more development off the east coast of the UK, moving further offshore like Dogger Bank. We'll see development off the east coast of Scotland, including projects like our own Berwick Bank, Ossian, and so on. So there's still mega projects to be delivered in deeper water, on the verge of very deep fixed bottom, and also some earlier floating projects. I think that will all be exploited before we move west, because the sea conditions are really challenging.
Let's talk about Ireland, because very similar to the UK in terms of its positioning and the natural resources. But it does seem as if the development of offshore wind is taking longer there than it has done in the UK. As a major developer in Ireland, what are the issues around that? What's the potential for Ireland as an offshore nation?
Yeah, well, Ireland has its unique set of challenges, but also advantages. So in terms of electricity demand, Ireland is only a tenth of what the UK consumes. So there are limits on how much renewable energy and energy in general can be sustained in the island. So that's been one of the challenges historically. As well as that, developing and operating onshore wind in Ireland, which SSE have done very successfully. That's been the story of the scaling of renewables in Ireland, with very limited offshore development. Now that onshore development, while it's still continuing, is becoming more challenges. There's only so many mountains and windy places onshore, whereas the offshore coastline in Ireland has been relatively unexploited. So what we've seen in Ireland is a government focus on supporting onshore, but now as that's, if you like, reaching peak, let's say, there's a lot more focus in offshore, and we've seen, the Irish government have auctioned seabed and provided offtake contracts for a number of projects off the east and moving further south in Ireland for kind of the first wave of offshore commercial scale offshore wind development, and that includes our Arklow project, which we're very excited about, and could and should be one of the first major offshore wind farms built in Ireland. So
this conversation, it just seems that the opportunity is vast and a lot's been done, but we're probably just at the tip of the iceberg in terms of what this industry can do. Tell us a little bit about you and how you got to where you are just now. How did you end up in the vanguard of what is a kind of emerging but very exciting industry? And what's your advice to those who are thinking, this sounds great, I want to be involved in this? How do they get involved in the industry?
Well, I started my career just about as far away from renewable energy as you could get. I worked in the chemical sector, and as part of that, worked in a coal-fired power station in the chemical sector, and that was just because of the locality where I grew up. That was the big employer was the chemical plant that was in the town. So I joined engineering from quite a different background, but I joined Electricity back when it really was a startup, in the early 2000s, whenever onshore wind in Ireland, as it was at the time, was really pioneering, the beginning of a transition away from fossil fuels. So these, tiny company, small number of employees, very entrepreneurial, and so on. And it was through that, and ultimately the acquisition of Electricity by SSE, that I moved into more, larger scale renewable technology, and ultimately into offshore wind. So it was a kind of an evolution. The advantage for people coming into the industry now is that the industry is already huge. So I was there for, if you like, whenever we were the wild cards, we were the kind of crazy entrepreneurs. What's happening now actually is that the renewables in general, and offshore wind in particular, is a big industrialized industry. that has massive opportunity and a huge number of a huge demand for resources and talent. And that's one of the challenges that we really face as an industry, is that there's so many projects being built all around the world, not just in the UK and Ireland, but all around Europe and all around the world. And everyone is short of talented people and capable resources. So SSE, like many other companies, are constantly hiring into this industry. But it's also not just about engineers. So I'm from an engineering background, and there's a perception that the energy industry is kind of engineering heavy, which it is to an extent. But I talked earlier about how these investments are as much about financing and legal and commercial structures. And we also engage heavily with local communities, so communication and engagement. We engage with politics and policymakers, so political capabilities are really important as well. So we would encourage, and I would encourage people from a diverse range of backgrounds to get interested, get involved in the industry, find out a bit more about it, particularly if you're at the beginning of your career. But most importantly, don't discount yourself because you're not an engineer. We need more than engineers in this industry. We need people who can finance projects. We need people who can operate assets. We need people who can sell our story to local communities. And we also need people who can influence government. So that's a huge range of skill sets and backgrounds that we need.
From coal to renewable, some journey.
It is indeed. Yeah, it was indeed.
As you look back, are you thinking, actually, I'm glad to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
Absolutely. Yeah, it's bear in mind, when I worked in the coal and chemical sector, that was state of the art, and that's all there was to a large extent. What's really exciting now is that you can kind of have it all. You can be part of a big company with lots of career opportunities and have the financial stability of a company like SSE that has a huge balance sheet, a huge number of employees, lots of opportunities to work in different parts of the business, but also do that while ultimately saving the planet and driving down the cost of energy for consumers. It's kind of what's not to like about that.
Paul, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us. We hope you found value in today's episode. If there's something that struck you in particular, let us know about it in the comments below. And of course, we're all learning in this industry. Please like, subscribe, and share this episode with one of your colleagues so we can all learn a little bit quicker. With that, see you next time.